The village of Millhaven was still and cold that morning. Fog sat low on the ground and curled around the fence posts like smoke that had forgotten to rise. Most people were still inside, warming their hands by their fires and waiting for the day to begin. The dirt road that ran through the center of the village was empty except for a few chickens picking at the mud near the well. Walter Grain was on his porch. He was sitting in his old wooden chair with a cup of tea balanced on his knee, watching the fog move across the fields. He did not have anywhere to be. He never did anymore. 11 years had passed since he had last worked as a medic, and in those 11 years he had learned how to sit still and let the mornings go by without asking anything of them. He was 64 years old. His hair was white and thin. His hands were rough and spotted from years of work. His right knee ached every morning without fail and his back was not much better. He drank his tea slowly because there was no reason to drink it fast. That was when he heard the sound. It was a dragging sound. Slow and uneven. Like something heavy being pulled across gravel by something that did not have the strength to carry it properly. Walter looked up from his cup. Coming up the road was a dragon. Not a large one. Not the kind that made the ground shake or blocked out the sun when they flew overhead. This one was small. A boy by the look of him. His scales were pale gray, almost the color of morning cloud, and several of them along his left side were cracked and dark with dried blood. His left wing hung behind him at a wrong angle, dragging along the dirt road like a broken piece of cloth. He was limping on 3 legs, holding his front right arm against his chest as if it hurt too much to put weight on it. He was moving toward Walter's porch. Doors opened along the road. People stepped out of their homes and stood on their own porches, watching. A woman pulled her 2 small children behind her. A man near the well picked up a long stick without quite deciding what he planned to do with it. Someone at the back of the small crowd said something sharp and low that Walter did not catch. The dragon boy reached the foot of Walter's porch steps. And then he simply fell. Not a dramatic fall. Not a crash. He just ran out of whatever had been keeping him going and went down onto his knees in the dirt at the bottom of the steps. His head dropped. His breathing was loud and rough, like something inside his chest was not working the way it should. For a moment he did not move at all. Then he lifted his head and looked up at Walter with 2 pale yellow eyes that were full of something that had nothing to do with anger or threat. They were full of fear. The kind of fear that a child carries when they have already tried everything else and this is the last door they have left to knock on. "Please," the boy said. His voice was small and broken at the edges, like a stick that had been bent too far. "My brother," he said. "He is dying. You have to help him. Please. You have to." The crowd murmured. Walter heard pieces of it. Someone said to send for the guard. Someone else said it was a trick and that you could never trust a dragon coming into the village like this. The older woman near the back called for her children to come inside right now. Walter looked at the boy. He looked at the cracked scales and the dragging wing and the way the boy was shaking from the effort of having made it this far. He looked at those yellow eyes and the fear sitting in them like water that had nowhere to drain. He set his cup down on the small table beside his chair. He stood up slowly because his knee did not allow him to stand up any other way. He was not a tall man and he was not a strong one anymore, but he stood up straight and he looked at the boy at the bottom of his steps and he did not look away. Then he turned and went inside. The crowd watched the door. The dragon boy watched the door. For a moment there was only the sound of the chickens near the well and the low voices of the people on the road. Then Walter came back out. He had his coat on. In his right hand he was carrying an old brown bag, worn soft at the corners from years of use. It had hung on the hook beside the front door for 11 years. He had never found a reason to take it down and he had never found a reason to use it either. He had simply left it there the way a man leaves something when he is not ready to say it is finished. He came down the porch steps one at a time, careful with his knee, and he stopped in front of the dragon boy. The boy was staring at him. Like he had asked for the moon and someone had actually gone to get it. "Where is he?" Walter said. His voice was calm. It was the voice of a man who had asked that question many times before in much worse places than this. "The eastern forest," the boy whispered. "Near the old creek." Walter nodded once. He started up the road without another word. "Come on then," he said over his shoulder. "Show me the way. And keep up if you can." Behind him the crowd stood and watched and said nothing. Not one of them followed. The eastern forest was not a place that most people from Millhaven walked into without a good reason. The trees there were old and grew close together, and the light that made it through the branches was thin and gray even in the middle of the day. The ground was uneven, full of roots and stones and soft patches of mud that could turn an ankle if you were not paying attention. Birds went quiet when people walked in. The whole place had a way of making you feel like you were being watched by something that had been there much longer than you. Walter had been in worse places. He walked at a steady pace, not fast but not slow either. His bad knee made itself known with every step down a slope, but he did not stop and he did not complain. He kept his eyes on the boy ahead of him and his bag close to his side. Ember moved through the trees with the kind of focus that only fear could produce. He was still limping badly and his broken wing kept catching on low branches, but he did not slow down. He pushed through everything in his way like it simply did not matter, because for him right now nothing mattered except getting back to his brother. Walter let him lead. But after a few minutes he spoke. "How long ago did it happen?" he asked. His voice was quiet. Not soft in a nervous way. Just low and even, the way a person speaks when they do not want to startle anyone and they do not need to raise their voice to be heard. Ember glanced back. "Last night," the boy said. "Before the sun went down." Walter did the calculation without showing it on his face. That was a long time for a bolt wound to go untreated. Too long in most cases. But he kept walking and kept his voice level. "Where did the bolt hit him?" "His chest," Ember said. "The right side. Near the front." "Did it go all the way through?" The boy shook his head. "It is still inside." Walter nodded slowly. He said nothing for a moment, just walked and thought and listened to the sound of his own boots on the forest floor. "Tell me what happened," he said. Ember was quiet for a few steps. Then he started to talk. They had been out in the forest the evening before, far from the part of the territory where their family usually stayed. Ember had wandered too far, the way he sometimes did. He was small for his age and curious about everything, and his brother was always telling him to stay closer. But Ember had heard something in the trees and followed it without thinking, the way young things do when they have not yet learned that the world does not always reward curiosity. The poachers had been waiting. There were 4 of them. Men with nets and crossbows and the kind of quiet, practiced movements that said they had done this before. They were after Ember. A young dragon that small and that pale would bring a high price from the right kind of buyer. They had him surrounded before he even knew they were there. His brother had heard him cry out. He came fast and he came angry, crashing through the trees with the full weight of a young dragon who was not yet fully grown but was still large enough to scatter men like leaves in wind. He knocked 2 of them off their feet before they could react. A third ran. But the 4th one, the one who had stayed calm while the others panicked, had put a bolt into him at close range before disappearing into the dark. Ember had found his brother on the ground a few minutes later. He had tried to pull the bolt out himself and could not. He had tried to move his brother and could not do that either. So he had stayed with him through the night, pressed against his side to share warmth, and when the morning came and his brother's breathing had grown rough and slow, Ember had made a decision. He had walked to the village. He had not known who Walter was or that Walter had been a medic. He had simply gone to the first door that felt like it might open. Walter listened to all of it without interrupting. When Ember finished, Walter said, "You did the right thing. Coming for help." Ember did not answer. He just kept walking. They had been in the forest for nearly 40 minutes when Walter heard it. Water moving over stones. The creek was close. Ember picked up his pace and Walter followed, pushing through a curtain of low branches into a small clearing where the ground sloped down to the edge of a narrow stream. And there was the brother. Walter stopped. The dragon was young, maybe a few years older than Ember, but already large. His scales were a deep brown with streaks of dark green running along his back and sides. He was lying on his side with one wing folded beneath him and the other spread out across the ground like it had simply given up. His chest was rising and falling, but the movement was shallow and uneven, and there was a gray pallor around his mouth and eyes that Walter had seen before and did not like seeing again. The bolt was still in him. Walter could see the shaft of it just below the shoulder, buried deep. He did not stand and stare. He walked straight to the dragon's side, set his bag down on a flat stone, and crouched beside the wound. He looked at it closely without touching it yet. His eyes moved slowly and carefully across everything in front of him. Behind him Ember stood very still. "Is he going to die?" the boy asked. Walter unclasped his bag. "Not today," he said quietly. "Not if I can help it." Walter did not look up when he heard them. He had known they were there for a few minutes already. The sound of boots on dry leaves and the low murmur of voices gave them away long before they reached the clearing. Some of the villagers had followed after all. Not to help. Just to see. They stood at the tree line in a loose group, staying back far enough to feel safe, close enough to watch. Walter paid them no attention. He had already opened his bag and laid out what he needed on the flat stone beside him. Old tools worn smooth from years of use. A pair of forceps. A curved needle and thread. Clean cloth folded into neat squares. A small glass bottle of antiseptic that was more than half empty. A bone-handled knife with a thin blade that he kept sharper than anything else he owned. He looked at the bolt again. It had gone in at an angle which was both bad and good. Bad because it meant the path was not straight and removing it would take care. Good because an angled entry sometimes meant it had missed the deeper structures by just enough. He pressed 2 fingers gently around the shaft, feeling the tissue, reading what was underneath without being able to see it. The dragon flinched and made a low sound. "I know," Walter said. "I know it hurts. Stay still for me." His voice was the same as it had been on the road. Calm and low and unhurried. Like he had all the time in the world even though he did not. He had spoken to men that way on the battlefield. Young soldiers who were frightened and in pain and who needed something steady to hold on to while the world fell apart around them. He had learned a long time ago that the voice mattered almost as much as the hands. A man who was calm could sometimes keep another man alive just by sounding like he believed it was possible. He picked up the thin knife. Behind him he heard someone at the tree line draw a sharp breath. A woman's voice said something quiet and worried. A man told her to hush. Walter did not turn around. He worked slowly and carefully, making a small, clean cut to widen the entry point just enough to give him room to work. The dragon's breathing changed when he did it, going faster for a moment, and Ember made a sound like a wounded animal from somewhere behind Walter's left shoulder. "Talk to him," Walter said without looking up. Ember blinked. "What?" "Your brother. Talk to him. It does not matter what you say. Just let him hear your voice." There was a pause. Then Ember moved closer and lowered himself to the ground near his brother's head. He put one small clawed hand against the side of his brother's face and began to speak. Quietly at first, barely above a whisper. Then steadier. He talked about small things. The creek they used to race each other to when they were younger. The way their mother made a specific sound when she was pretending to be angry but was not really. A joke that his brother had told him once that had not been funny at the time but that Ember had laughed about later on his own. Walter listened while he worked. He had the forceps in now, moving slowly, feeling his way. This was the part that could not be rushed. One wrong angle and he would do more damage than the bolt had. His hands did not shake. They had not shaken in 40 years of this work and they did not shake now. Whatever else age had taken from him, it had left him his hands. The bolt moved. He felt it shift and he stopped and waited and then began again, very slowly, coaxing it along the path it had come in by. The dragon's whole body tensed. A low rumble built in his chest like distant thunder. Ember kept talking, his voice cracking slightly now but not stopping. Then the bolt came free. Walter set it down on the stone and did not look at it. He was already pressing clean cloth against the wound with firm, even pressure. He held it there and counted in his head the way he had always done, slow and steady, giving the bleeding time to begin to slow before he moved to the next step. At the tree line someone let out a long breath. He cleaned the wound as well as he could with what he had. The antiseptic was almost gone by the time he finished. Then he took the curved needle and the thread and he closed the wound in small, tight stitches, each one placed carefully, each one pulled just firm enough and no more. It took a long time. The light in the clearing shifted as the morning moved toward midday. Walter's knee ached from kneeling on the hard ground. His lower back made its feelings known in a deep and persistent way. He ignored both things the way he had always ignored them when there was work in front of him. When he finally tied off the last stitch he sat back on his heels and looked at what he had done. The wound was closed. The bleeding had stopped. The dragon's chest was still rising and falling, and the rhythm of it had evened out slightly from what it had been when Walter arrived. Not strong. Not easy. But steadier. Walter let out a slow breath through his nose. He picked up a fresh piece of cloth, wiped his hands and looked at the dragon's face. The young dragon's eyes were half open. Glassy and unfocused, but open. Ember pressed closer to his brother and made a sound that had no words in it. Walter reached out and rested one rough old hand briefly on Ember's small shoulder. "He is still here," Walter said quietly. "That is enough for now." The villagers who had stood at the tree line did not go home quietly. They went home talking. By the time Walter had packed his bag and settled himself onto a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, the story was already moving through Millhaven like water finding its way downhill. It passed from porch to porch and door to door, picking up details as it went. Some of the details were accurate. Some of them were not. But the center of it, the part that everyone agreed on, was this. Old Walter Grain had walked into the eastern forest alone with a worn medical bag and had pulled a dying dragon back from the edge with nothing but his hands and whatever was left in that bag. That part nobody changed. Because that part was simply true. By midday the story had left Millhaven entirely. It traveled with a trader heading south and with two farmers who had cousins in the next valley. It moved faster than Walter would have expected and further than he would have cared about. He was not thinking about any of that. He was sitting on his log, drinking tea from the small flask he kept in the side pocket of his coat, watching the clearing. Ember had fallen asleep. It had happened slowly, the way sleep takes children who have fought it for as long as they possibly can and then simply cannot fight it anymore. The boy had been sitting pressed against his brother's side, talking, and then his voice had gone quiet, and then his head had dropped, and then he was gone. Asleep with one small arm draped across his brother's neck and his broken wing folded awkwardly against his back. Walter had watched it happen and said nothing. The wounded dragon, whose name Walter had learned was Ash, was not asleep. He was in and out of something that was not quite sleep and not quite waking. His eyes opened sometimes and looked at the sky above the clearing and then closed again. His breathing was still slow, but it was steady, and steady was what mattered right now. Walter drank his tea. He heard them before he saw them. Not boots this time. Something heavier and more deliberate. The sound of something large moving through the forest with the kind of patience that said it was not in a hurry because it did not need to be. The birds went quiet again. The light in the clearing seemed to shift slightly, the way it does when something tall moves between the sun and the ground. Then the elder stepped into the clearing. She was very old. Walter could see that immediately. Her scales were the color of deep river stone, dark gray with a blue undertone that caught the light when she moved. They were worn smooth in places the way old things get worn smooth, not from damage but from simply having been in the world long enough. She was large, larger than Ash by a considerable distance, but she moved with a kind of careful quietness that made her size seem almost beside the point. Her eyes were amber and very clear. She looked at Ash first. A long, slow look that took in everything. The closed wound. The steady breathing. The boy asleep against his side. Then she looked at Walter. Walter looked back at her over the rim of his flask. She stepped further into the clearing and two younger dragons that Walter had not noticed came in behind her and stopped at the edge, watching. The elder approached slowly, her eyes moving between Walter and the wounded dragon with an expression that Walter could not quite read. She stopped a few feet away. "You are the one," she said. Her voice was deep and even, like a large stone dropped into still water. "I am a medic," Walter said. "Retired." The elder looked at the stitched wound. She looked at the clean cloth and the empty antiseptic bottle that Walter had placed back in his bag. She looked at his hands around the flask. "We were told a human had done this," she said. "I came expecting to find a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Walter said. The boy asked for help. "I helped." The elder was quiet for a moment. Her amber eyes moved to Ember, still asleep against his brother's side, and something in her expression shifted. "Not much. Just enough to notice." "You came alone," she said. "Into the forest. For a dragon you did not know." Walter shrugged once with one shoulder. He needed a medic. "I was a medic." The elder looked at him for a long moment. Then she lowered her great head slightly, just a fraction, in a gesture that was small and deliberate and clearly meant something. "We are in your debt," she said. "Whatever you ask, if it is within our power, it will be given. Gold, lad. Protection for your village. You have only to name it." Walter was quiet for a moment. He looked down at Ember sleeping in the clearing. The boy's face was relaxed now in a way it had not been since Walter first saw him on the porch steps. The fear was gone from it, at least for now. He looked like what he was. A young child who had been through something terrible and had finally found a place safe enough to rest. Walter looked back at the elder. "Has the boy eaten?" he asked. The elder blinked. Her amber eyes studied his face as if checking to see whether the question was the beginning of something larger. It was not. Walter simply waited. "Not since yesterday," the elder said slowly. Walter nodded. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a small wrapped parcel of bread and dried meat that he had packed that morning out of habit and had not touched. He set it on the ground near Ember's hand. "Then start there," he said, and took another sip of his tea. The afternoon was getting long when Ash opened his eyes properly for the first time. Not the half-open, glassy look from earlier. This time his eyes opened all the way and they stayed open and they were clear. He lay still for a moment, looking up at the sky through the gap in the trees above the clearing. Then he turned his head slowly and looked at the small human sitting on the log a few feet away with a flask in his hand and a worn brown bag at his feet. Walter noticed and looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Ash tried to move and made a sound low in his throat when the wound reminded him why that was a bad idea. He settled back and breathed carefully through it. Ember stirred against his side, murmured something without waking and went still again. Ash looked at his brother's face for a long time. Then he looked back at Walter. "You did this," Ash said. His voice was rough and dry, but it was steady. "Your brother found me," Walter said. "I just did the work." Ash was quiet. His eyes moved to the stitched wound on his chest, then back to Walter. There was something working behind those eyes, some feeling that was too large to come out quickly and so was coming out slowly instead, finding its way up from somewhere deep. "He walked to the village," Ash said. "On that leg." "He did," Walter said. Ash closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again they were brighter than before, and Walter looked away and took a sip from his flask to give the young dragon a moment of privacy. The elder had moved to the far edge of the clearing and was speaking quietly with the two younger dragons. Arrangements were being made. People were coming who could move Ash safely once he was stable enough. There would be proper care waiting for him, the elder had said. The best they had. Walter had nodded and said that was good and meant it. He began to pack his bag. It did not take long. He folded the remaining cloth and tucked it in. He put the forceps back in their place. He looked at the empty antiseptic bottle for a moment and then put that back too. The bag closed with a soft clasp and he set it on the ground beside his feet and rested his hands on his knees. He was tired. The good kind of tired that came from work that had been worth doing. He was about to stand when he felt it. A hand on his arm. Large and careful. The grip of something that could have crushed the arm entirely and was making a very deliberate choice not to. Walter looked down at the clawed hand wrapped gently around his forearm and then looked up at Ash, who had pushed himself up onto one elbow despite everything and was looking at him from a distance of less than 2 feet. This close Ash was very large. His eyes were dark green with flecks of gold near the center. They were looking at Walter with an expression that had no performance in it at all. No formality. No distance. Just something completely honest and completely open. "Thank you," Ash said. 2 words. Quiet and simple. But the weight behind them was not simple at all. Walter had been thanked many times in his life by many people in many conditions. He knew the difference between the kind of thank you that was just something people said and the kind that came from a place so deep that the person saying it had no other words for what they meant and so they used the only 2 that came close. This was the second kind. Walter held the young dragon's gaze for a moment. Then he put his free hand briefly over the clawed hand on his arm. One pat. Firm and warm. "Take care of that wound," Walter said. "And take care of your brother." Ash nodded slowly and lowered himself back down. Walter stood up, picked up his bag and turned toward the path home. Ember was awake. Walter did not know when it had happened, but the boy was on his feet at the edge of the clearing, watching him with those pale yellow eyes. The food Walter had left was gone. Some color had come back into the boy's face. His broken wing still hung wrong and his limp was still bad, but he was standing and he was looking at Walter like he had something to say and could not find the words for it. Walter stopped in front of him. Ember opened his mouth. Closed it again. Walter waited. "I did not think anyone would come," Ember finally said. Very quietly. Like a confession. Walter looked at him for a moment. "I know," he said. "That is why it matters that someone did." He started up the path. Ember followed. He walked Walter all the way back through the eastern forest and out the other side and up the dirt road into Millhaven without saying a word. Just walked beside him, close enough that his wing occasionally brushed Walter's coat. When they reached the edge of the village where the dirt road met the main path, Walter stopped. People had gathered without quite meaning to. Villagers on their porches and in their doorways. A group of dragons at the far end of the road, the elder among them, still and watching. Nobody had planned this. They had simply ended up here. Walter looked down at Ember. The boy looked up at him. Then Ember pressed his small head briefly and gently against Walter's shoulder. One moment. Then he stepped back and stood straight. Walter put his coat collar up against the evening air and walked home alone. Nobody spoke. Not the villagers. Not the dragons. Nobody. They just watched the old man walk away down the empty road with his worn bag in his hand and his bad knee and his white hair and his straight back, getting smaller with every step. And every single one of them knew they had seen something they would not forget.